pink one. Hi everyone, afternoon, lovely to see you all. I'm Andy Haldane, I'm the CEO here at the RSA. Welcome to the great room for those in the room. Welcome to this presentation for all of those online. I know there's many hundreds of people online. This is being live streamed right around the world, which is fantastic. A particularly warm welcome, of course, to our very special guest today, philosopher and economist Daniel Chandler. As some of you will probably know, we've been challenging ourselves over the course of this year at the RSA to think bigger, to think bolder, to think imaginatively and ambitiously about how the world could be. What could go right is the question we've been asking ourselves over the course of this year. And to answer that question today, we really couldn't ask for someone better placed as a speaker than Daniel. Daniel, excusing your blushes, is an absolute rising star of contemporary public debate on the economy, on society. He has an impressive prior career in public policy with stints at the IFS and the Resolution Foundation, and indeed the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. He's now a research economist at LSE, which is how I first heard about him from my friend Tim Besley. And most importantly, of course, for today's event, he's just published a brilliant book. You have to take my word for it. Those are the words used by such luminaries as Amartya Sen, a Nobel laureate, and Zadie Smith. They're also the words used by non-luminaries, including me. So in Free and Equal, a copy is there. What would a fair society look like? Daniel argues that the ideas we need right now can be found in the prior work of one of the intellectual and philosophical giants of the 20th century, namely John Rawls. So today, Daniel's going to be giving us his pitch for why Rawls and why now, both at the general philosophical level, but also, importantly, what that might mean as a practical matter. And that's an issue I hope we can return to in the conversation. What is the policy agenda that should flow from this way of thinking? So Daniel will speak for about 20 minutes or so, outlining the book and some of the policy ideas in there. Then we'll open it up to the floor for conversation. So come on with your questions either in the room or online. We'll get through as many of those as possible. I hope before we finish promptly, I've been told, at 2 o'clock. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Daniel Chandler.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you so much, Andy, for that very generous introduction. I've always thought the RSA would be the perfect place to come and talk about this book, and now knowing that your theme for the year is what could go right, I think the match really couldn't be better, because that's really the sort of spirit of the book, is one of setting out a constructive, optimistic agenda for how we could change our societies. So I'm going to start my remarks with the question that's the subtitle of my book. So what would a fair society look like? I think most of us would agree that the society we live in is far from fair. We might not all agree on exactly what's unfair about our society, but I think most of us would point to a pretty familiar list of problems. A political system that's dominated by the rich, the profound influence that class, race, and gender continue to have on so many people's lives, vast inequalities, and a climate and ecological emergency. And yet, despite those problems, and despite, I think, the growing appetite for change, it's surprisingly hard to find a coherent picture of what a better, fairer society would actually look like. Our political debate often feels narrow and technocratic, as if economic growth is the only thing that matters. And I think especially at the moment, it feels as if we're being buffeted from one crisis to another without any longer-term sense of direction. And I think that lack of vision is not only a problem for those of us who think our societies stand in need of far-reaching reform, It's this moral and ideological vacuum at the heart of our politics that has made space for a dangerous, illiberal and anti-democratic populism. It's in moments like this, where we've lost our sense of direction, that I think philosophy can really come into its own, helping us to step back for a moment from the latest crisis and scandal and, reflect on what our values are as a society and where it is that we want to be heading. And yet I think most people today would struggle to name a recent thinker who could give us the kind of inspiration that we need. The good news, and the central premise for my book, as Andy mentioned, is that the ideas we need are actually hiding right in front of us in the work of the great liberal philosopher John Rawls. So Rawls is really the towering figure of 20th century political philosophy. He completely revolutionized his discipline and is routinely compared to the greatest thinkers in the history of Western thought, from Plato to Hobbes, Kant and J.S. Mill. That reputation rests above all on his book, A Theory of Justice, whose publication in 1971 marks a real watershed moment in the history of political ideas. As the philosopher Robert Nozick put it in 1974, political philosophers must now either work within Rawls's theory or explain why not. And I think to a large extent the same continues to be true today. What I think is so exciting about Rawls's ideas is that he doesn't only ask the very biggest questions about justice, fairness, and how we should organize society, he gives us answers. And what we get from Rawls is a vision of the best that a democratic society could be, given the facts about human nature and the natural world that we live in. And he called this a realistic utopia. And it's this vision which I think makes his ideas such an unparalleled resource, both for restoring faith and enthusiasm, faith in and enthusiasm for liberal democracy, and for developing a progressive politics that could actually change our society for the better. So what was Rawls's vision? At the heart of his theory is a strikingly simple idea, that society should be fair. I think that idea of fairness resonates right across the political spectrum, but obviously it means very different things to different people. Rawls proposed a thought experiment, which I think is probably one of the most famous thought experiments in the history of political thought, that could help us move from this abstract idea of fairness towards a concrete set of principles that we could use to design our most important political and social institutions. So he argued that if we want to know what a fair society would look like, we should imagine how we would choose to organize it if we didn't know which person we would be within that society. So whether we would be rich or poor, gay or straight, black or white, as if we were behind a veil of ignorance. And if we were to organize society in that way, he argued that we would be fair, in the same way that someone might cut a cake more fairly if they didn't know which slice they were going to get. I think it's pretty clear that if we didn't know who we would be, we wouldn't choose to organize society as it is today, where some people have to rely on food banks in order to feed themselves, or where class, race, and gender continue to shape people's life chances in such a profound way. Rawls uses this thought experiment to identify two fundamental principles of justice concerned with freedom and equality, respectively, and hence the title of my book, Free and Equal, alongside a further principle of sustainability. And it's when we get to these principles that his ideas start to get more practical. So just to go through those principles, first we would want to protect our most fundamental freedoms, both personal freedoms like freedom of speech, religion, sexuality, but also political ones, like the right to vote, to criticize the government, and to organize political parties. And this first principle, which Rawls called the basic liberties principle, is in effect a justification for liberal democracy, and it's the basis for designing our political and legal system. His second principle, which actually has two interlocking parts, provides a framework for reimagining our social and economic structures. So first, Rawls argues that if we didn't know who we would be, we would want to guarantee what he calls fair equality of opportunity, basically to make sure that everyone has a fair chance in life, irrespective of their class, race, or gender. Now, many liberals have been willing to stop there and argue that as long as everyone has a fair opportunity to develop their talents, that we don't need to worry about inequality. But Rawls rejected this idea, arguing that in addition to giving everyone a fair start in life, we also have to make sure that prosperity is widely shared. And that brings us to the most innovative and, in many ways, radical feature of Rawls's theory, which he called the difference principle. So Rawls argued that we should organize our economy so that the least well-off are better off than they would be under any alternative economic system. And from this perspective, a degree of inequality can be justified. Higher pay for some people can provide incentives to work or study or innovate, but those inequalities are only justified if they actually benefit those who have less, and not just a little bit trickling down to those at the bottom, but benefiting those at the bottom by as much as possible. Finally, Rawls argues that we would adopt a principle of intergenerational justice or sustainability. And the most basic requirement of that is to maintain the stable climate and vital ecosystems on which our societies depend. So together, these three principles provide a really astonishingly coherent and comprehensive and ultimately, I think, very practical framework, both for identifying what's good about our institutions, where they fall short, and then most importantly, for thinking about how we can improve them. So it's hard to overstate Rawls's influence within academia. As I said before, he's compared to the greatest thinkers in the history of Western thought. And yet his ideas have had relatively little impact on real politics. I think Rawls's personality is part of the explanation. He was a very shy and modest man. He disliked public speaking. He had quite a severe stutter. And he had little interest in playing the role of public intellectual and largely stayed out of public life. I think it also reflects the politics of the times. One of the ironies of Rawls's legacy is that just as his ideas were coming to dominate political philosophy and setting out a very inclusive, humane and egalitarian liberalism, politics was moving in basically the opposite direction, with a harsh and individualistic neoliberalism being championed by the likes of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Finally, though, I think it also reflects the fact that Rawls didn't really say very much about how we could put his principles into practice, believing that this was a job best left to social scientists. And unfortunately, that task has been badly neglected, and I think slightly reflecting the gap that has emerged between philosophy and the social sciences. And my aim in Free and Equal, as both an economist and a philosopher, is really not just to bring Rawls's ideas to a wider audience, but to pick up where he left off and set out a practical agenda for how we could make his vision a reality. I think part of what's so exciting about Rawls is that his theory and those three principles give us a single framework for thinking about so many of the challenges that we face today, from how we can overcome culture wars to addressing the climate crisis, all the way through to how we can transform our economy. But in the sort of short time that I have here, I'll just pick up on a couple of these topics to give you a flavor of where I think these ideas can take us. So first, I want to talk about how Rawls's ideas can help us to reinvigorate democracy, since I think unless we reform our political system, it's going to be difficult to make progress on almost anything else. What's distinctive about Rawls when it comes to thinking about democracy is his recognition that while formal rights like freedom of political speech and association or the right to vote are obviously essential, on their own they're not enough. So for Rawls, political equality is not only about having these equal formal rights, but having substantively equal opportunities to exercise those rights and to take part in and influence the political process much more broadly. And in a large-scale democracy like ours, that process of influence and participation is mediated by some really key institutions, particularly political parties and the news media. And yet, as things stand, those critical democratic institutions are disproportionately influenced by the rich. So if we take political parties, in the UK, nearly half of all donations at the last general election in 2019 came from just over 100 super donors, each of them giving an average of nearly £450,000 each. And that is obviously a ridiculous way for a democracy to function, and it violates the principle of political equality in a very obvious way. So what can we do? If we want real political equality, then I think we should limit private donations to a very low level, or even ban them entirely, and replace them with a democracy voucher scheme, where every citizen would be given an equal amount of money, say £50 per year or per election cycle, which they could give to the party of their choice. I think that system would instantly transform the incentives of our political system. Rather than having to go cap in hand to a rich and unrepresentative donor class, political parties would have to appeal to engage with everyone. And this isn't just a philosopher's pipe dream anymore. So in 2017, Seattle adopted exactly a scheme like this. There have now been 3 elections run under the democracy voucher scheme in Seattle, and the results are exactly as you would expect. More people getting involved in politics, often from underrepresented groups, more people standing for office, and incumbents being more likely to lose. I think a similar system, voucher-based system, could also be extended to funding public interest news media, giving us a way to tackle the control of a few super wealthy media tycoons. And while getting money out of politics, I think, should be our first priority, I don't think we should stop there. I also argue in my book that we should replace our first-past-the-post voting system with proportional representation, and that we should significantly expand the role of citizens' assemblies, where the members are selected at random from the population, perhaps even going as far as replacing the House of Lords with a second chamber that's selected in that way. And I think the combined impact of all of those changes would really transform our democracy and move us radically closer to the democratic ideal of genuine political equality. So the second topic I want to touch on is how Rawls's ideas can help us transform or even transcend capitalism as we know it. So I think the first priority for reforming our economic system has to be to tackle the climate and ecological emergency that we face, while there's still time to avoid the very worst consequences. I think the choices that we make now are going to shape the future of life on Earth, and each of us has a profound moral responsibility, not just to change our individual behavior, but to take political action so that our governments recognize the gravity of this crisis. And in my book, I set out some of the things that we would need to do, including massive public investment in renewables, the electrification of almost everything, and introducing an economy-wide carbon tax. But I want to focus today actually on how we can tackle inequality, because I think it's here that Rawls's ideas have something more distinctive to offer. There's a growing consensus that inequality has reached unacceptable levels in our society, and I think growing interest in the notion of shared prosperity or inclusive capitalism. But those terms are typically used very vaguely, and most practical proposals that are attached to them amount to little more than tinkering at the edges. What we get from Rawls's difference principle, this idea that we should organize our economy so that the least well-off are better off than they would be under any alternative system, gives us a much more precise and also strongly egalitarian definition of shared prosperity. And as the experience of the past few decades has made abundantly clear, there's nothing inherent to how markets work, either in theory or in practice, that means that economic resources will be widely shared, let alone that they will maximize the resources available to the least well-off. If we look across Western Europe and North America since the 1980s, the top 1% of earners captured 28% of the overall increase in incomes, which was more than 3 times the amount going to the entire bottom half. So the conventional solution to the inequality generated by markets is redistribution. And Rawls's theory has often been interpreted in this way too, as effectively an argument for a more generous welfare state. But I think this seriously misrepresents Rawls's ideas and fails to grasp their more transformative implications. So for Rawls, economic justice is not only about the distribution of money, but about power and control and dignity and self-respect. And I think it's by putting these questions back on our agenda that Rawls's ideas can really transform our political debate and help us create a new political economy that's not only more equal, but more humane. I'm just going to set out three pieces which I think are the sort of core framework to what this new economic approach might look like. The first would be to introduce a universal basic income or something like it. Our current welfare system, with its very tight targeting and punitive system of conditionality and sanctions, creates massive stigma and stress, as well as serious disincentives to work for those on the lowest incomes. And a universal basic income would eliminate those problems at a stroke. As the philosopher Philippe van Parijs, who's a well-known advocate for a universal basic income, puts it, whereas our existing system provides a safety net that fails to catch a great many people that it should catch, and in which many others get trapped, a universal basic income would provide a floor on which all can safely stand. Alongside a universal basic income, I think we need a much broader strategy to tackle inequality at its source, or what's come to be known as pre-distribution. So a key part of this is raising wages, particularly for low earners, and I think at the heart of that has to be investing much more in skills for the more than 50% of the population who don't go to university, alongside strengthening collective bargaining and things like minimum wages. At the same time, I think we also need to look much more at the distribution of wealth. So as things stand, the wealthiest 10% of households hold nearly 60% of all wealth in the UK, whereas the bottom half have just 5%. And I think if we want to change that in a significant way, we need to explore some pretty radical options, like introducing a universal minimum inheritance, a lump sum payment to every 18-year-old that could be in the region of £100,000 per person, funded by progressive taxes on wealth. Finally, I think we need to embrace a radical shift in the balance of power within workplaces. So I think the idea that companies should be controlled by their owners or shareholders is so familiar that we rarely stop to question it. But the concentration of power in the hands of owners is a choice. And we don't have to look very far to find very different ways of doing things. So in Germany, workers and owners share power on a much more equal basis under a system known as co-management or co-determination. And under this system, workers have 1/3 of the seats on the board in companies with more than 500 workers, and half the seats of the board in the largest companies with more than 2,000 workers. And contrary to the reasonable fears expressed by economists, this system has worked remarkably well. Most studies find that the overall impact on the performance of these companies, whether that's investment, productivity, profits, or long-term longevity, is small and as likely to be positive as negative, while there are serious benefits for workers. In the UK, we've seen some proposals for adding 1 or 2 workers onto the boards of companies, but I think we should go much further and look at adopting a maximal version of the German system where workers have half of the seats in most, if not all, companies. Finally, I just want to comment briefly on the politics of these ideas. I think it's easy to feel pessimistic that across the world's advanced democracies, basic liberal values and institutions are under threat. But I think our present moment is also one that's rich with possibility. Just as the 1980s saw the triumph of neoliberalism over the post-war social democratic settlement, we are living through another era of transition, the outcome of which will define the shape of political discourse and public policy for the next generation. And for all its challenges, I think this moment represents an opportunity to break with neoliberalism once and for all, and to set society more firmly on the course of justice, fairness, freedom, and equality. Seizing this opportunity, though, will require progressive parties to lead rather than to follow, to move beyond the politics of triangulation and focus groups, and to make a fundamentally moral argument about why and how we can change our societies for the better. In an era where voting patterns are no longer tied to class in the way that they used to be, putting values at the center of politics is not empty idealism, but a really essential part of any serious political strategy, since it's values that can provide the glue which binds disparate groups together. And I think Rawls's ideas offer the basis for a broad-based and genuinely transformative progressive politics. They provide us with a unifying moral vision that is both an alternative to identity politics and that can help us overcome the culture wars. And as I've argued, they point towards a policy agenda that genuinely matches up to the scale of some of the challenges that we face. In the end, there's no guarantee that these ideas like these will become a reality. There's no guarantee that liberal democracy itself will survive. But this isn't cause for despair, but a reminder that it's within our power to change our world, for better and for worse. And the aim of my book is really to help us recover a sense of possibility about the future. But in the end, it's up to us, both individually and collectively, to build a society in which we are, at last, truly free and equal. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for that very elegant setting out the arguments in what I know is a tremendously rich book. And I'll kick off, and then we'll go quickly to the floor and indeed online for some questions, because I know there's lots and lots that have been sent in already. Can I start with, we had up on this stage, 6 weeks ago now, Alexandra Matvichuk, who's a Ukrainian human rights lawyer, winner of last year's Nobel Peace Prize, actually, her organisation. And among many, many compelling points she made was one about we need to understand that we need to be producers of democracy every bit as much as consumers of democracy. And I wondered how, based upon what you had to say there about governance and democracy, how we would do that so that people own and produce democracy and don't just consume it.
That's a great question. I think there's maybe two parts to it. I mean, one thing I think is to bring back a much more important role for civic education, and I think embrace an active role for the state in cultivating the kinds of basic liberal democratic values and also practices and attitudes that will help sustain a democratic society. I think the vocational aspect of our education system has come to totally dominate, and the civic aspect, which for a long time was really recognized as being essential in liberal and democratic thought, has been really overshadowed. And funding for civic education has gone down. The amount of classes being taught has sort of disappeared. So I think that would be one part of it, to recognize a more significant role for the education system in nurturing those values, and not just through targeted civic education classes, but I think that's something that should inform the curriculum within schools much more broadly. I think it points towards a more important role for the humanities and for things like service learning, where you go out of the classroom and get engaged with the community. I also think something like a compulsory national civic service is something that we ought to consider. So I think there's a sort of set of things you could do there within broadly the school and education system to try and foster attitudes and virtues that would underpin a healthy democracy. And maybe I think the other thing is to provide people with opportunities to be producers of democracy. I think part of the problem with the design of our democratic system as we have it is that other than voting, there isn't much of an opportunity for people to get involved. And part of the appeal of that democracy voucher idea is that it creates another way in which people can directly participate in politics. And I think one that would actually lend itself to a more sort of communal way of doing things. You can sort of imagine if political parties want to raise money from these vouchers, they could organize more social events that would bring people together to talk about politics in a way that is not necessary when you only have to gather, a handful of super rich donors to give you money. And I think, I touched on in the remarks that I gave that I also think there's we should be looking at expanding the role of forms of more direct participation, including through citizens' assemblies, but also I think you could have so those citizens' assemblies would still involve a relatively small number of people, selected at random, so that sort of gets the tick for political equality, but maybe not for mass participation. But I think at a more local level, there's also room for things like participatory budgeting, and I look in the book at the case of Porto Alegre in Brazil, which is famous for developing a system where local residents are much, much more involved in determining how money is spent on various local priorities. So I think that the other part of it maybe is creating the spaces so that people can actually be participants and producers in democratic life.
Fantastic, fantastic. And just bridging from the governance side of things, you didn't, given the time, have a chance to elaborate on your views around the intergenerational aspect of justice. Daniel, the sustainability bit, if you like. But how best we bring that about? Because it strikes me, this short-termism problem, which gets in the way of intergenerational justice, is not confined to our politics. It's as true of our businesses. It's as true of us, actually. We all can live our lives and make decisions in a way that's rather near term and doesn't give enough weight to our to future generations. How do we break into that knotty problem, do you think?
Well, another good question. And I don't think I'm not sure if there is an answer that would sort of fit across the piece. I mean, the sort of generic answer, I think, is to design our institutions in a way that recognizes the tendency towards short-termism. And I think when it comes to questions about sustainability, the system that we have, the sort of outlines of the sort of legal political infrastructure that we have in the UK is actually not a bad way to go. So we have the Climate Change Act, which does set out a very long-term goal for the government's ambition, and sets requirements on the government to meet net zero targets by 2050, and those requirements are monitored by an independent climate change committee, enforceable by the courts, and the government has actually been, was found to be in breach of its obligations and had to go back and produce and sort of come up with new ideas. I think that kind of system is roughly the right way to go. That seems like a system that's been fairly well designed to at least move us in the direction of taking a longer term perspective. It obviously isn't working perfectly. I don't think there's no way you can't completely design out short-termism that's in the democratic process without undoing democracy, I guess. So I think the best that you can hope for is to make these kinds of institutions stronger. So I think that model would be well extended beyond just questions about climate and towards other ecological issues too. And I think it would be good to strengthen the role of the courts, make it more difficult for governments to wheedle out of their commitments. But in the end, I think there's no institution that can ultimately force a democratic government not to be short-term, and it's down to all of us to hold our politicians to account.
Quite so. Let's open it up. I'm usually going to start online actually today, because I know there are literally dozens and dozens of questions sent in online. And here's a more globally oriented one, Daniel, to kick us off, which is, how would a Rawlsian vision of fairness work for the global south at present? Nice, easy question to kick off, I thought.
Well, I suppose there's maybe two parts to that question. One is whether this Rawlsian vision of what a just society would look like would be appropriate for how those countries would organize themselves internally. So, the focus of Rawls's theory of my book is on what Rawls calls domestic justice within a country, as opposed to global justice, which is justice between countries. Yep. Sorry. And obviously both are incredibly important, but my book is, I suppose, about the domestic side of things. And I don't think there's any reason why, I think the principles that Rawls set out are as applicable to countries in the global south as they would be to countries in the richer north. the policy priorities, I think, would be different, and I think I'm not expert enough on the challenges facing, anyway, it's such a broad term anyway, to sort of comment on the details. But I think, that the framework, I think, is applicable to any country that aspires to uphold broadly liberal and democratic values, but the policy priorities would be slightly different. I think on the question of, there's also the question of justice between countries, how we design the global trading system, and that's obviously enormously relevant to achieving justice for the global south. And I don't know if I should hazard a start there, because that would be sort of the beginning on a completely new topic that unfortunately I haven't addressed in the book. Rawls did actually write another book called The Law of Peoples, where he did set out some thoughts on the topic of global justice, but they've been they're much less widely accepted, and I'm not sure if I agree with them as much as I do as the sort of the theory that I've taken here, which is partly why I've sort of set them to one side as a project for another time.
It's your next book, Daniel. That's
Yeah.
what. And we look forward to that one as well. Let's go to the floor and wait for a hands up. Well, there's roving mics, I hope. Or maybe there's not roving mics. Is there roving mics? There should be roving mics. There they are. Here's Alex. 1 second while we get a roving mic. While we're waiting for that, let me ask another question online then. These are all great questions, I'm pleased you're answering them. Does a fair society make philanthropy redundant? And if not, what role might it play?
I think a fair society would make philanthropy not strictly necessary. I think in a fair society, people's basic rights and opportunities and the overall distribution of resources in society would be determined by the institutions that are ultimately shaped by the state. So I don't think no one would be relying on philanthropy in order to meet their basic needs. I don't think it would make philanthropy redundant, though. I think that, Rawls's theory of justice is a theory for our most basic social and political institutions, and I think that leaves lots of space for all sorts of other activities. It's not meant to be a theory that tells us how we should go about living our lives in sort of every detail. So I think, that beyond, I think what this theory what fairness would be about is establishing the sort of fundamentals and the essentials. But then beyond that, people might want to go further, and I think that would be, it's trying to create, I suppose, an environment. This theory is trying to create an environment in which people could go on and do more. So I suppose philanthropy could do any of the other things that people care about, and which are sort of not picked up here. I'm not sure if that's
No, that sounds very sensible to me. So what philanthropy wouldn't be doing in that world is providing a backstop safety net that the state wasn't providing.
Yeah, exactly.
But actually civic institutions ought to be stronger off the back of this.
Yeah.
You'd want them to be stronger off the back of
Yes. I like that answer.
We now have a mic, and we'll go here and here, Paul and here, to start off with. We'll take them in sets of twos, if that's okay, Daniel.
Great.
Thanks very much. My name's Paul Atherton. I'm a fellow here. I've written an essay on the RSA's website called You're Living in the 21st Century, but You May Not Have Noticed, which is 16 cultural references that people should read and consume to kind of get an understanding of where we are today. Two of those works include Donna Economics, Kate Raworth, and Utopia for Realists, Rutger Bregman. But it also includes The Great Hack and The Social Dilemma. And my question is, considering that the most influential thing we have today that shapes our world and how we see things is the internet, and that internet is fundamentally corporatized by global corporations, did you cover any of how we control the internet to control the media in the book? Or if not, how do you feel you should do it?
Hold that thought, Daniel, big one, and then we'll go over here at the front.
Thank you for a great talk. That was really inspiring. I'm Vanessa and I'm a fellow. I had a slightly different question, actually. I wondered how we can address the really sort of quite massive fundamental blocks there are to inequality, in particular things like land ownership. In architecture at the moment, there's some great projects around community land trusts and sort of the idea of the commons and land ownership. But conversely, there's been lots of sort of news in the media about land owned by the royal family and how that sort of inherited wealth in terms of land seems to be a real block to equality. And I just wondered if you had thoughts on that.
Daniel, big tech, big land.
Difficult, big questions. Actually, and I should confess, neither of those are ones that I get into in that much detail in the book, even though the book does cover a lot of stuff. So I guess on maybe starting with the question of land ownership. Actually, that's one of the things I most regretted not putting in the book was the case for a land value tax, which I think is very strong. And, you know, I think the way that I would approach, you know, I suppose I haven't looked into this in detail, but I think the way that I would approach the question of land ownership is to think about what system of land ownership would ultimately benefit the least well off, one that would sort of encourage prosperity that could be widely shared. I'm not sure exactly where that would take me. I suppose what I do look at the book is the broader question of ownership of sort of physical wealth and assets, including land. And one of the things that I argue for is, well, I say that, so I mentioned the idea of this universal minimum inheritance earlier. That's one way of redistributing ownership. But an alternative to that, or possibly a complementary policy, is for the state to build up a citizens' wealth fund where taxes on wealth would be used for the state to purchase a share in companies, but also in other assets like land, and then the proceeds of you know, the income that's generated from those assets in that fund could be distributed to citizens on an equal basis as part of a way of paying for a universal basic income if one was in place. So I guess that's one mechanism through which we could redistribute the ownership of land and use that in a way to benefit everybody. But I suppose it's not very specifically aimed at the question of land. But so I think that's a sort of an interesting, good question that I'd like to think about more.
It's for the third book.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You keep a note for me of all the books I end up having to write at the end. And this will be, so internet regulation, I don't get into in great detail. I mean, I have a discussion of the media's role in the functioning of democracy and how we can't just leave it to the market to ensure that we have either the reliable information that we need or information that comes from a diverse enough range of sources. And I think that the problems of concentration of control and ownership that exist, the problem of concentration of control of ownership as it relates to news and media exists both online and in more conventional media. And, you know, I think I'm not going to wing it and make up new ideas for regulating the internet right now. But I suppose that maybe the one thing I would say is that sometimes people who come from a liberal perspective are very wary of that kind of regulation as if it undermines some vital basic freedom. And I think Rawls' approach gives us a very different perspective. I think what you get from Rawls is a recognition that there's a collection of really essential basic freedoms that includes freedom of speech, but also includes political equality and all of the things that are necessary to make that a reality. And then what we need to do is find a way to balance those freedoms in a way that promotes democracy whilst also protecting our sort of individual freedom of speech. And so I think there's a flexibility there that I think would lead to much more reform than we currently see at the moment.
Now, in passing, but I mean, in the same spirit, I really liked your idea that you just began to elaborate around vouchers to support some public media presence. We've seen the sort of the slow death of local newspapers in this country. I think that's a real tragedy, actually, for the democratic process. And we need something that can act as a brake on that. And I think that's the best idea I've heard for doing it.
Yeah.
Question online. Daniel, is there anywhere in the world you look at and think that's heading in the right direction? They could have read my book.
It's interesting. I mean, I guess there are lots of examples of really great things being done in lots of different countries that I draw on in the book. So Seattle with their democracy vouchers, more participatory democracy in Brazil, the German system of co-management. I mean, I guess the countries that are probably closest overall would be sort of Scandinavian social democracies. I think those are the closest to realizing this vision. But I think they also have significantly further to go. So, you know, those Scandinavian countries don't have as developed a model of workplace democracy as is the case in Germany. And in any case, I'm arguing that ideally we would go further than what exists in Germany. Similarly, they don't have in place the kind of systems for bringing about political equality, either in as it relates to parties or the news media. So I don't think there's anywhere that's sort of got it exactly right, but I think those countries are probably the closest that we can see right now. And I guess it's important not to forget that those places do exist. They are doing a lot of stuff really well, and not to, I suppose, although I'm suggesting that in many ways we should go further, I also don't think we should take for granted or kind of poo-poo the achievements of those countries compared to so many others.
No, and the very fact that they demonstrate proof of concept, these things are not hypothetical, they exist, albeit in atoms around the world, is I think a very important, a really important point. Let's get back in the room. A forest of hands. Let's take a couple here and a couple here. We'll start on this side of the room.
Hi. On your redistribution point, how do you provide incentives for those seeking outsized financial rewards with innovation to stay in this system and not go and generate wealth in another system?
You should pass the mic along. There's another question just further down the row, and then I'll let Daniel pick those two up.
Thanks. I love the Rawls work, and in fact I've been looking at it in workplace, particularly in workplace resilience and organizational engagement with that. But the how-to is the biggest challenge, right? Because we all know what and why, but the how-to, and so you've given some ideas. But I've just been part of a conversation on international development, on shift the power. And actually that's kind of one of the critical things of how do you actually take this into a scalable change beyond just German companies, or how do you look at it systemically? And because the ideas are there, but it's the incentives to not do it are so strong. And I'm sorry to be negative, but it's
Fantastic. Why don't you pick those two up?
Yeah. So on the question of maintaining financial incentives, I think the first thing is that I think there's a tendency to overstate just how important financial incentives are. I'm not wanting to discount them, because I think part of what's so valuable about Rawls's theory is that he recognizes that they do matter and they do have a role. But if we look at, I suppose there's a lot of debate about what the overall level of taxation should be, and whether if taxes were to go higher, that would somehow cut off the engine of economic growth, because it would deter people from working. And actually most of the economic studies that have looked at countries with very different levels of taxes and how they've grown over time find a very weak relationship between the overall level of taxes and how big economies are or how fast they're growing. And so countries like Denmark and Finland that have an overall tax take 10 or maybe 15 percentage points higher than America have experienced very similar longer-term growth rates. And I think the explanation, there's sort of two parts to the explanation for that. I think, part of the explanation is that when we think about taxes, we focus a lot on the negative effect they might have on growth by dulling people's financial incentives, and we tend to overlook how the money that's raised through taxes can be spent in ways that will increase productivity and growth. And I think over the long run, any negative impact on incentives that's come about through higher taxes in countries like Denmark and Finland seems to have been largely balanced out by those positive effects. But I think the other part of the explanation is that financial incentives just aren't as important as we are often led to believe in determining how much people work. And I suppose there have been studies that particularly have looked at how top earners respond to changes in the tax rate. And actually what stands out is that, well, what really changes when you change taxes on top earners is that they start moving money around and shifting it from employment income into self-employment income, or moving it sort of across borders. What happens much less is that people don't seem to really change their actual economic behavior that much, like the amount that they work or the kinds of work that they do. So, and I think this is the good news, I guess, that comes from that is the opportunities that people have to shift money around are much more within our control. We can't force people to work more if we increase taxes, but we can stop them from taking advantage of lower tax rates on capital income by equalizing the tax on capital income versus income from employment, that kind of thing. So I hope that goes some way to answering your question. How can we make any of this happen? I mean, I think part of my answer is, you said that we sort of know what we need to do, and I suppose I'm not as sure that we do have such a clear. I mean, some of us, I suppose, feel like we know what we need to do, and in a sense, I agree with you that the ideas that we need are kind of out there, but I think they're not very present in our public discourse, and that one step in bringing about a political movement that could make these kinds of changes actually happen in the world is to be much clearer about what it is that we want and how they all fit together as one, in sort of one coherent whole. In a sense, that's the purpose of the book, is to try to do that and to move beyond picking out individual examples by putting them together into one sort of systematic frame. So hopefully, if you read the book, what I hope is that people will come away from it not just with a sort of shopping list of policies, but more with a sense of how everything fits together. And I think that's that's what Rawls can help us with, by giving us this big philosophical framework. And I guess what I've tried to add to that is then the practical ways in which we could make things happen. I mean, I think on the politics side of thing, I don't think I have a full answer, and I'm not sure if there really are general answers to be had about how to bring about political change. I think it depends so much on the circumstances in a particular time and place. Maybe the only general thing I would say is just to not discount how important values can be in politics. That most people don't study the details of individual policies in the way that people who are very engaged with politics might. People respond to narratives and stories about where a country is and where it could be going, and I think those narratives are usually underpinned by some sense of moral value or vision, and so I suppose providing that is at least, it's one part of moving towards a realistic political program, but obviously not the whole.
Fantastic. One more online. I like this question, actually, because I'm intrigued to know your answer to it, Daniel. Should democratic government be viewed as a career opportunity, or should it be considered an act of public service? And should leaders be elected based upon their moral fitness rather than their politics or political party? So can we take the politicians out of politics?
That's a good question. I mean, I suppose, I think that we should think of politics as a form of public service rather than as a career. Although I think to me, career and public service go very well together. It's a career in public service. But I suppose public service is ultimately what politics should be about. And I think what we get from Rawls partly is a vision of politics as the pursuit of the common good, rather than a sort of an avenue for advancing the sort of sectional interests of one part of society or another. I feel like, can you repeat a bit more of the question? Because I feel like I had other...
So could you imagine a politics where there sort of weren't political parties, there were just issues?
Yeah, well, that I think, so I do touch on that in the book because, I discuss this idea of making more use of citizens' assemblies and random selection. And I think there's a lot of interest at the moment in that as a different way of doing democracy. And part of the appeal of it for a lot of people is that it would be a politics without politicians, because citizens would just be selected at random. And in the end, I don't think that that is a good idea as a wholesale replacement for an electoral democracy. And I think the reason for that is that I think political parties do actually serve a very important function in our politics, that they're an institution for cultivating a particular kind of expertise in society. Some of that is expertise about policy, but it's also, I guess, political expertise in a broader sense of being able to articulate a vision of, where society ought to go or what the problems are. And I think it makes sense that there would be a degree of a division of labor within a society, and that some people, that we need people and institutions that are focused on doing that role, and that without them, I think it would be difficult. I don't think we would have a fully healthy democracy. So I think the challenge is more to make those parties work better and to balance them out with other institutions that provide for more direct participation. So it's kind of, I suppose it's more a model of a kind of mixed democracy, in the same way that you might have a mixed economy that combines, public and private ownership. You have both elections and political parties, but also forums for direct participation.
Very good answer. Excellent. Back in the room, I've got time for, I reckon, for one or two more questions, and we'll go here and here, and then we'll have to wrap things up, I'm afraid, because we'll be out of time.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Daniel. It was great to hear you speak. My name's Simon Jones. I'm a fellow here. Despite being desperate to ask my question, I'm now terrified, so just bear with me a second. I'm also going to read it out because it's a little bit involved. I'm thinking about wealth distribution and asset ownership in a society, in an economy like ours. And I think you said that in the UK today, half of us own less than half of the wealth, less than 5% of the wealth. Yeah. And so I'm thinking, so if we imagine that in this long-term democratic project that we're living, the project of social progress, one that's taking us from serfdom, hopefully, to economic independence. I think that's a fair approximation. And in that project, we can imagine that the disenfranchised have voted for their own economic emancipation over time. If that's the case, then is it also true that when we reach a ratio of pretty much 50-50 asset owners to not, do we then end up in some kind of unwelcome equilibrium in which further social progress is then a lot more difficult to obtain, because you've basically got equal-sized parties on either side of the debate? So is that where we are? Because I don't know about you, but to me, the US and UK politics, they feel a little bit stalled at 50-50 in this kind of way. That's it.
Excellent question. And one at the back there, and then we'll ask Daniel to briefly answer them.
Hello. So I was wondering whether we as Britain have a moral obligation to intervene and implement this Rawlsian framework you're talking about in countries that are yet to accept it, since we are actually responsible for much of the systemic oppression that goes on in these countries. For example, the backing of Saudi Arabia and the funding of war in Yemen, for example. Thank you.
Daniel, briefly, if you don't mind.
So just to start with the second question, I think, so I mean, in a sense that touches on this question of justice between countries, which isn't the focus of my book, but I can still say a couple of things. I think we have a moral obligation not to support countries that violate the absolute basics of this kind of framework, like Saudi Arabia. So yes, I think our moral obligations are clearer in what we shouldn't do, which is, you know, that we shouldn't be supporting countries that violate the most basic human rights of their citizens. Whether we have an obligation to intervene in countries in order to push them towards this vision, I think I'm more skeptical about. I mean, that's when Rawls did write about questions of global justice, he was right at the heart of that theory is an idea of really respecting the sovereignty of countries to determine their own political system, even if it isn't a democratic one. And even if, you know, however much we might want those countries to be democratic, to only intervene in the most extreme of circumstances. So that's Rawls's position, and it seems like a good starting point to me, and I'm not, but I'm sort of feel I would need to think further to give my own considered judgment on it. On the question about the distribution of wealth and political change, I guess, so I think the first thing is, I think what we would ideally be aiming for is, and I may have misunderstood the question, but not a society where 50% have wealth and 50% don't, but where wealth is much more equally distributed right across the piece. And, you know, I think that the divide between people who have wealth and those who don't right now, which is, I guess that's more where we are now, even if it's a long way away from 50-50, I think that is a huge obstacle to change. And I want to come up with a really rousing, I wish I had a rousing way to tie that up, but I think it's, you know, I think it's by motivating, I suppose there's two parts, I guess, to overcoming it. One is to motivate the people who, the 50% that don't have wealth, to give people confidence that a different way of doing things is possible and legitimate, and to hope that that project will also persuade many of the people who, you know, who might stand to lose to some extent from implementing these policies. And I don't, you know, it's not impossible to think that many people could support that kind of politics if articulated in the right way. I mean, it's true of lots and lots of people in countries across the rich world, including here, support welfare policies that they don't benefit from directly. And if anything, some of the political support for more progressive or redistributive measures does now come from richer university graduates who don't directly benefit from it. So I think there's a problem there in that progressive parties are maybe failing to connect with the people who might benefit most directly from these kinds of ideas. But there's also hope in the sense of that it's clearly possible to build bridges across those groups if you have the right ideas.
And that's a lovely optimistic note on which to end. Rousing. Time is up, alas. Time is upon us. We'll need to wrap up. Everyone watching online, the many hundreds online, thank you for your comments and your questions, of which there were huge numbers. If you're an RSA fellow, and if you're not, you really should be, you can join our new platform Circle and continue the conversation now. There's a curated chat that takes place off the back of Daniel's talk. If you're online, you can also click into some links and buy a copy of Daniel's book, which I can recommend. I'm not saying actually sat next to me, but he's sat next to me. And I have a copy already, which I asked him to sign as I am wrapping up. And for those in the room, you can buy your own copy, signed by Daniel. You'll see it playing out in front of you. After this, just outside here, I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. How lucky are we? I should have said this is the first public airing of Daniel's book. And what a privilege it's been to hear from him. I'm sure to have a long and lasting impact. It certainly deserves so to do. So please join me in thanking, as usual, fantastic Daniel Chandler. Thank you. Thank you.